Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Sewell Chan, Editor-in-Chief of the Texas Tribune. Thank you for joining us in person and online for our conversation with Austin Mayor Kirk P. Watson. I want to begin by thanking today's sponsors, our presenting sponsor, City Health, and our major sponsors, Raise Your Hand Texas, AARP Texas, Circuit of the Americas, the Lowy Law Firm, and the Texas Municipal League. Though corporate sponsors and donors underwrite this event, they play no role in determining the content, speakers, or line of questioning. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank our Texas Tribune members joining us in person and online. We are grateful for your support. If you value events like this one and you're not yet a member, please consider supporting the Tribune. Head to texastribune.org/donate. Some housekeeping notes. We will have about 45 minutes of Q&A, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for your questions, audience questions. Please silence your cell phones. If you'd like to tweet from this event, please use the hashtag #TTEvents. I'd like to introduce Mayor Watson. Kirk Watson served as mayor of Austin from 1997 to 2001, and in the Texas Senate from 2007 to 2020. He also served as the first dean of the University of Houston's Hobby School of Public Affairs. Mayor Watson has chaired both the Greater Austin Chamber of Commerce and the Texas Advisory Board of Environmental Defense, and received the President's Citation from the University of Texas at Austin. Welcome, Mayor, and congratulations on your taking office on January 6th.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, and I appreciate everybody else being here. Thank you all for coming out.
Mayor, let's get started. You won a very close election. In fact, it was a very, very slim margin, and for a few days, the outcome in Travis County, for example, wasn't even fully known. I think it's fair to say that the election outcomes revealed certain divides in Austin, the economic ones, geographic ones. Your support was more concentrated in the West, and even racial and ethnic and generational divides. How do you bring the city together, and how in particular do you reach out to the nearly half of voters who supported your opponent in the runoff, Celia Israel?
Well, I think first we have to recognize that elections are about learning. And in fact, when I first started practicing law, the way I ended up in Austin, Texas, was I worked for a federal judge. And at the time, there was a big controversy about should we elect judges or should we appoint them. And I'll never forget, he had been both elected to the bench and he had been appointed. And I remember asking him at the time, should we elect them or should we appoint them? And I mean, that quick, he said, elect them. And that kind of surprised me. It was that quick. And I said, tell me why. And he said, because there's not a person alive that if they're paying attention, they start a campaign and then they finish the campaign and they're the same person. And so I think that's a good lesson about elections. That's what the campaign is supposed to be about, is to clarify issues. And I think if somebody wants to be the kind of mayor that is a mayor for everybody in Austin, you have to listen to the people that didn't vote for you, maybe just as much, if not more, than the people that did. And there's a whole lot about those that supported my opponent in that race that their message is one that I agree with, and now I need to help live up to. Things like inclusivity, things like equity, things like making sure that when we're doing things, we're paying attention to not just how you started where it might benefit those who are making the most complaint or the most noise, but all those who aren't being able to show up and be a part of it. So I think you start with listening, and I intend to follow up on that. I listened very carefully during the campaign, and I intend as mayor to follow up on that. The second part of that is you have to be intentional, and I intend to be, I guess I used that word twice, didn't I? I intend to be intentional. I intend to make it a part of how I think about things. When I think about where something, I want to go on something, I'm going to start with the premise that we need to figure out how we make it where it's inclusive enough that we're not enhancing division, but we're actually trying to reduce those divisions. So I think it's listening, I think it's being intentional, and I think it's getting out there and being among folks that maybe didn't vote for me, but want the city to succeed, and so I owe them the obligation of being part of that.
You know, Mayor, image that we it was that, you were certainly supported by most of the city's top decision makers. The Statesman reported that half your campaign donations came from 4 zip codes. What are you doing specifically to reach out to residents of East Austin, to renters, to young people, and to multicultural Austin?
Well, you asked that question, what are you doing? I've been in office 17 days now, so I may not be able to answer that as specifically as you like, but here's what I intend to do. I intend to, and I'm going to be clear about one part of this. One of my frustrations during the campaign was that there were things that I was talking about that didn't get the kind of coverage and let people know some of the things that I wanted to see. For example, a major part of what we talked about was how we address inequity in wealth and what we might do to take out structural barriers that are creating some of that inequity over the long haul. Things like, we talk about, and I'm sure we'll talk about it here, affordable housing, but sometimes you can build a structure that's affordable, quote affordable, but people that don't have access to capital or to credit, it doesn't matter. They still can't afford that because they don't have access to the money. That's a structural problem. Child care and early childhood development. That is something I talked about and was frustrated it didn't get more traction. So my point being that we've already started. We started in the campaign talking about the kinds of things that will make a difference, I think, in people's lives. Again, even though the numbers in the campaign and the results in the election may suggest that they didn't vote for me, because we need to do that. That's the kind of mayor I want to be, and was already talking about it. So it's not going to be that far a leap.
One more broad question, then we'll get into the issue specifically. When you were mayor the first time around, you had a quote to the effect of, "With this new economy, we have to make sure there are not unintended consequences." And I believe that ended up being a very, very prescient observation. On the one hand, of course, Austin represents the new economy. So much prosperity, technological innovation, biomedical innovation, new jobs being created here. It's become over the last 2 decades almost a national joke how many people moved to Austin, in particular from California. And has Austin, however, become now a victim of its own success? And how serious? How are you approaching this mayoralty, recognizing that it's a very different kind of political economy and a very different kind of political environment than when you were last here in the late 90s?
Well, there's 2 things that jump in my mind when you ask that question. One is that I wouldn't characterize Austin as a victim of its own success, but what I would say is that many of our greatest challenges are a result of success. And even those challenges that aren't a result of, directly related to success, the good news is we get to address those problems from a platform of success that most cities would just love to have that level of success and be able to address problems that way. So I wouldn't characterize as a victim of success, but I would say we have to address the success because that is a cause of some of our biggest challenges. The second thing that jumps out at me about that is that we are a different city in the respect that in 97 to 2001, I was proud to be helping navigate this city through its first big tech boom. And we were becoming a big city. We were becoming a big city. We are no longer becoming a big city. We are a big city. But yet, we still address some things as though we've got time, right? But we'll work on that later. Most of you will remember that during that period of time, we created the first resource center for the homeless. We created the first women and children shelter. We created the downtown community court to help provide service to those living homeless. We created the first affordable housing trust fund and other things, because those were issues that becoming a big city, we could see where they're going. They've now come to scale.
Yeah.
And that, so again, I wouldn't call us victims of that success, but we must pay attention to that success so that those unintended consequences I was talking about don't become so permanent they do damage.
So basically, the key difference is you're now a big city mayor
Well, yeah.
with big city challenges.
Yeah, with grayer hair.
Let's get into the homelessness challenge. Basic background, of course, most of you already here know. City Council a few years ago voted to lift a ban on street camping. Became very unpopular. The visibility, I'm not saying the numbers, but the visibility of street homelessness became much more apparent. Voter initiative in 2021 restored the ban. And then the state legislature, as I understand it, came in and basically said that that has to be the case throughout Texas. Very, very divisive issue, especially the voter referendum. Where do you stand on, well, let's start, before we talk about the street homelessness, let's start with what is your plan to build shelter and then eventually permanent supportive housing?
Well, I'm going to start with what I think hasn't happened that needs to happen. And that is, I think we've been given too much of an all or nothing choice. And the all or nothing choice, to make it simplistic, but it's accurate, I think, is on the one hand, camp anywhere you want to camp any time of day with no responsibility. On the other hand, it is permanent supportive housing that someday we're going to have. So camp until we call you and we're going to have a place for you to live someday down the road. And what I think is missing in that is a continuum of things that could happen along the way that would get people closer to services and maybe even be preventive, so that you're preventing homelessness, and then you have people where you can get services and then have an ability to get out a back door that moves you in to permanent supportive housing. And we have not done that. I'm a little surprised that I keep getting asked the question, do you favor supporting the camping ban, enforcing the camping ban? Well, the voters said enforce the camping ban. The legislature said we're going to mandate enforcing the camping ban. But because we were left with an all or nothing decision-making process, we don't have the infrastructure to humanely and adequately enforce the camping ban. And so what I think you have to do is you have to build some of that infrastructure. Again, 2 key points. You need to have infrastructure that can help prevent people living homeless, and you need to have infrastructure that helps people get to services with the idea that at some point you can put them into permanent supportive housing. And I've been, if you ask me in the past 17 days, what have you worked the most on, it would be that issue.
Now, you still have a somewhat divided society, even on enforcement. There are people in the central business district, small business owners, and some downtown residents who say the ban is unevenly enforced, that you're starting to see more street homelessness, or at least the perception of more, in various parts of downtown. Of course, there's a more left-wing kind of progressive faction that says that any kind of use of police resources to shoo homeless people off the streets is immoral, even if that's the law. How do you bridge that divide?
Well, first of all, you don't need police to do all of that. They need to be doing some things related to enforcing the law if there's a violation. Being homeless is not the violation.
Right.
But if there's activity on the streets downtown that may not even be homeless, but somebody living homeless, but it could be too. But if there's a violation of crime, you do need police for that. But I don't think we've spent enough time trying to figure out how it is that we go to someone that may be living on the street in downtown, a social worker or someone else that can help with the psychiatric aspects of that and help get them to another place so that you can enforce the camping ban in a humane way that helps them get services. That doesn't necessarily require a police officer. It does require that infrastructure. It does require that infrastructure that I don't think we have enough of. So the way you bring people together on something like that is you provide the access to services for the people you're dealing with. Both left and right will be in favor of that if we do it the right way.
We and others have reported on Houston's relative progress in addressing homelessness, and as I understand it, the strength of the public-private partnerships and the quality of the coordination among services, among jurisdictions, and among entities. private sector, NGO, nonprofit, and public sector, has been pretty crucial. Is Houston a model for Austin? And given that Houston's so much larger, if they can do it, why haven't we done it? Should we be able to do it here?
Well, I think there's no question we can do better, and I think we ought to be able to do where we're a national model. But again, I'm going to go back to what I think has been the error of the past few years. And the error of the past few years is it's got to be one or the other and not much in between. And I'll give one last example. We need to have a diversion center so that one of the things we're not doing is when somebody's on the street and they're having brain health issues, they're having a crisis related to brain health, mental health issues, we need to have a mechanism, again, building infrastructure that's not just permanent supportive housing. We need to have infrastructure so that a person suffering a crisis, we don't have to just put them in jail. We don't have to put them in jail and hold them in jail where we're not doing anything to help with the crisis. If we had a diversion center, and again, I've been working on that over the past 17 days to at least a temporary situation so that people can get the health care they need and then have ways out the back door. And what I mean by that is we bring them in and then out the back door puts them into a more permanent type situation. And that's been a passion of mine for years is mental health. And what we did when I was in the Senate with regard to what's going on at Austin State Hospital and other activities. Your question about Houston is when you start coordinating everybody and coordinating those kinds of services and don't make it an all or nothing proposition, you have better results.
So just to be clear, this plan, this diversion plan is aligned with Travis County Judge Andy Brown's interests in having, because of course the county oversees mental health, in having mental health diversion services.
Yes, in fact, I think he was the one that bought lunch. I probably owe him lunch when we talked about that. But yeah, there's clearly a need for us to talk about how we do that, both city and county, and that's one of the reasons I'm pushing. And of course, the good news is Judge Brown and I have been friends a long, long time.
And we'll talk about those relationships, which was a key part of your campaign pitch. Mayor, let's move to housing more generally. The New Yorker reports this week in a story about 3D printing of affordable homes based right here in Austin. Fascinating story. A statistic. The New Yorker says that real inflation-adjusted rent in Austin increased 45% in 1 year. You use the word crisis to describe what's going on in terms of affordability and cost of living. What is kind of your we're going to get to the land use, but what is your 100-day strategy for addressing the problems facing renters? And do you believe that the Biden administration, as it is contemplating, should intervene to do things like preventing evictions and finding other ways to keep people in rental housing?
So there's about 15 ways for me to answer that question, but let me start with, and I hope we're going to talk about things beyond just housing as part of how you help renters and others, but let's talk about just housing. One is, I think that one of the things that we need to do, and I've started a conversation at City Hall, and there are a number of members of the Austin City Council that this is their passion and they want to move almost immediately. And in fact, we're doing committees right now, and we had a work session this morning on committees, and the committee on housing and planning, we have too many people because everybody wants to be on it, right? It's that kind of situation, which is a good problem to have, right? So what I hope you will see in the first quarter that we're all serving together is will be a number of actions that will bring some immediate, maybe not, when I say immediate, it may not put a whole bunch of houses right on the ground, but I would love to see us, for example, working together with the professional staff, set aside, I don't know, how many bedrooms are going to get permitted in the next 3 months, and just set these goals and then experiment with how you get there. All the different ideas that came out of every council member and the mayor that all ran talking about how we're going to get more housing and just get it done. Even if and many of those things you're not going to need land code changes on. So things like that in permitting, development services.
Streamlining approvals.
And making it a priority. One of the things that I kept saying is during the campaign, and I'll say it here, is that if you know you've got an emergency, address the emergency. So we know we have a housing emergency. We know it's putting a burden on renters. We've got a problem here. So why don't we make that a priority? Why don't we create the one-stop shop for housing? Those sorts of things to just get it done and set a goal. I mean, we ought to just set a goal of how many units. I originally talked about how many permits. Let's make sure we issue X number of permits in Y number of months. And I've decided, no, it's probably more about the number of bedrooms because the permits actually add up after a while, the bedrooms after a while. So do those kinds of things. And I think this council there's a lot of energy behind this council, and I think they're ready to do that.
Now, in other big cities, there are ways to set aside and say if you're doing a development of X size or complexity or in X areas, you need to set aside 5, 10, whatever proportion of the units for low and moderate income. Texas doesn't allow that. Doesn't that deprive you of a major tool to work with the developers?
I had more than one bill not make it out of committee when I was in the Senate that would have made it given more tools for local governments. And yes, that deprives us of a tool, but we have tools that we haven't really used either. So for example, I would love to see us in a situation do some public-private partnerships where a private entity they're building several units. And because they get some sort of bonus, they are going to build Y number of units at 60 to 80% of median family income. Well, that's not low enough. So what we do is we come in, the city, with some of that bond money that has been passed over the years, and we become their partners, if you will, so that we buy down even more to get us to 20 or 30%. So people that are 20 to 30% of median family income aren't having to move out of the city. So there are tools that we have not yet explored. So before I completely whine about not having tools, I think we ought to be putting some of those into place.
Now, this city has multiple efforts to reform the city's comprehensive land use plan, which goes back to the 1980s, have been unsuccessful in recent years, most recently the Next Code project in 2018. What you put forward during the campaign, a plan that would allow the different districts in the city to play a very active role in land use. That ended up being a quite controversial campaign.
Only because it was mischaracterized.
Yeah, some portrayed it as modern redlining, some even said there may be racist elements.
I'll be glad when the media quits repeating the mischaracterization.
Well, fair enough, fair enough. Well, you're in a free and open forum. The floor is yours. Explain to us positively how your plan would work and why you think the local, the approach of having local variation makes sense.
Sure. Again, the problem with Code Next was that it was an all or nothing, winner take all. You take it or you leave it, and guess what? We got nothing. They left it because they made it they called it comprehensive, right? They even defended the lawsuit calling it comprehensive. It was an all or nothing approach to the entire city. Well, we live in a city that voted itself single-member districts. And one of the reasons that we voted for single-member districts, many reasons to vote for, but one of the reasons was that we wanted to allow for communities of interest and neighborhoods to be represented fully in what they thought they would want to see. And what happened when they basically said, well, we know that's what we did, but we're going to ignore that for purposes of trying to change this land development code, and we're going to make it comprehensive. What that did is it built in the ability for some districts that didn't like what Code Next did in their districts to have enough votes that it blocked it. They basically had a veto power. So what I said was, can we honor our system of government and still get land development code changes? And one of the ways that we can do that is, what if District X really liked Code Next in that district? So District X would come forward and say, here's what we want to do. We want Code Next, or we want some variation of Code Next. And that would allow then it wouldn't burden other council districts. It would be just for that district, so you would have less likelihood of there being some effort to block it, and you would get those changes. In addition, what I said was, let's incentivize that sort of activity. And what I built into that was, if we have a baseline already, and by the way, we need to have a baseline on affordable housing in every district in the city and all over the city. We have this blueprint that is essentially a baseline. So if one district is doing what I just suggested, and they're building more affordable housing faster or more of it than the baseline, they should be rewarded. And the way they should be rewarded is by allowing them to hang on to some of the increased tax base that they're creating for things like rental assistance, things like helping prevent displacement, parks, playgrounds, libraries, sidewalks, that sort of thing, to incentivize. It was not, as some characterized it, an effort to allow anybody to do a veto. Right. You have the baseline. And if you do something that's a citywide change, it is a citywide change. It was simply meant to be a means of moving districts forward in a way that they had been blocked before.
Fair to summarize this as saying that you have a baseline, but your system ultimately relies on incentives rather than mandates.
No, you may have mandates. You may have citywide mandates. For example, let's talk about ADUs just as an example, something, accessory dwelling units. Yeah. If we pass a citywide ordinance that says, here's what we're going to do to make it easier to have more density because you now can do ADUs, that would apply across the city. But it would incentivize some more activity by the way I laid that out. Now, you would still have citywide things that would be a requirement. Yeah. Another thing is along our corridors, our transit corridors. I mean, I see where we ought to have minimums in some instances there, as opposed to this is the maximum you can build. That would not be something that a district could say, oh, we're not going to do that.
And you think you can get council support? There are 3 new members, of course. Do you think you can get council support for allowing more ADUs, also known sometimes as granny units or in-law units? You think for those ADUs and for the transit-oriented development, yes. You think that there's support for that?
Yeah, I do. I think you'll see a lot of support for that. And by the way, that's the way to start this discussion. For too many years now, the discussion has been about, and with due respect, the way the question was asked, which is, what do y'all disagree on? I think we have to start new with what is it you agree on and then do it. Had that been going on for the last decade, we'd still be in a different place, even if you didn't pass Code Next.
Well, and not to be self-serving, but I think at the Tribune we do try to be serious about policy and trade-offs and less about conflict and drama. So I
said with due respect.
No, and it's a fair point, actually, and I think it's actually part of how we advance the discourse in productive ways and not just always be focusing on conflict. Let's expand the affordability conversation just a little bit, because as you say, it's housing, but it's also more than that. This has become such an expensive city to live in that there's a mismatch right now. I think it's fair to say there's actually a lot of jobs open in Austin, and they're high quality jobs and high paid jobs. But the workforce that we have locally, the graduates of the local schools, including non-college graduates especially, aren't always prepared for those jobs. How do you improve that match between our students, our young people coming out of schools in Austin, people who grew up in Austin, and the jobs and the opportunities that have now come here?
Well, it's a great question, and I'm going to approach it from 2 parallel paths. One is you have to focus on what those jobs are. And 2 is you focus on what the jobs will be. So right now we have about over 50,000 jobs that are unfilled. And I actually think that we also have a real opportunity when it comes to things like infrastructure. When you stop and think about it, you got Project Connect, you've got things going on with I35, you got a redo of the airport, and then everything else in that context. Just that alone, the number of jobs that's going to create over the next decade to 20 years is immense. We have to shift our economic development paradigm. Our economic development paradigm for some time now has been, we get to the end of the year and we count the number of W-2s we created, and we pat ourselves on the backs and say, look at all those jobs we created. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying you don't want to create those jobs. You want to create those jobs. But we shouldn't pat ourselves on the back until we talk about how many of those jobs we filled with local talent. So you will see very shortly me lay out a proposal that talks about how we shift that paradigm and how we talk about workforce development. And you'll see a focus, frankly, on infrastructure and things of that nature, so that what we do, and I think one of the things, and I think we'll be the first city in America that does this, maybe not, but if I can't find one, that what we do is we do a survey, if you will, of where the gaps are. And then once we have that survey of where the gaps are, we immediately turn to trying to fill those gaps so that we fill those jobs. From an affordability standpoint, there's two ways that I can make something affordable. One is I can subsidize it or make it cheaper, or I can put more money in people's pockets. And one of the things that our success, I mean, we've had great success in creating wealth and fortunes in this town, but it hasn't been as much for everybody. And so part of what I want to do with this workforce program is achieve that.
Now, do you support a kind of basic income, a plan that at the national level has gained a lot of resonance, particularly among young people?
Well, I did not support and would not support doing what the basic income or the guaranteed income pilot program that was done here.
Why not?
Well, I think you can use that money better. And I don't, I would rather use the $1 million that they had for things that I know I can control in terms of helping affordability, and that would be things like paying city employees more, or using that money to incentivize police officers to stay with the city of Austin or to come and work at the city of Austin. I think it's, I would not support just doing that again.
Should major corporations that locate to Austin, Travis County, Central Texas be required to either directly provide housing for all these new workers or subsidize the cost of that new housing?
Well, I think what we ought to do is that ought to be part of what our program is, which is to try to have more employer-based programs. And I think there's an opportunity for that. I think with what you've seen with Tesla and the number of people that have come and trying to find, I mean, I know they know there's an issue there and how they want to address it. Frankly, I think Samsung, when Samsung decided to go to Taylor, that created a huge opportunity for us to talk about housing and how employers can help us with housing, but also talk about it on a regional basis because, and I'll say it tongue-in-cheek, but there ain't no houses in Taylor for it to keep up with what's getting ready to happen in Taylor. So we have opportunities that we're going to need to seize in order to be able to move that. But that ought to be part of our overall approach and policy is we want you here, we want to create those jobs, we want to change the paradigm to help fill those jobs, but one of the key things is we have to have places for people to live.
One more question about housing and affordability. Part of Austin's history, of course, is the Plan of 1928, which was the city plan that essentially enforced both racial and economic segregation. We still see the scars and the effects on that plan in our own city today, of course. Should you run for re-election in 2 years and continue and be real? We'll get to that.
Good.
Should you accept that? Should you seek that mission and gain it? You'd be mayor until 2028. What, in your view, would an Austin of 2028 be like to correct the mistakes of 1928?
Well, first let me say I don't think we should ever forget the mistakes of 2028. I think that's
1928.
1928. What did I say? 2028. Yeah. And by the way, if I run for re-election, that will not be with the mistake of 2028. But 1928. I'm sorry. You're right. We can't forget that, and it needs to be something that we emphasize and we focus on as we try to make decisions. But one of the way I would see that is that we would have taken a conscious effort to break down more structural barriers than we have done in the past. I mentioned one. I mentioned childcare too. I think that we need to have a focus on childcare in such a way that it's not just some folks that have access to affordable childcare and early childhood development, but everybody in this community has access to it. Because when I look at structural problems, that's one of the big structural problems, is you've got people in this community who can't afford early childhood development in a way that their children, I mean, there's some children that are ahead of them because we've got a structural barrier. So I think one of the things a big part of this is we ought to always examine our policies to ask, is there something structurally that's keeping that from being equal for people, and make sure we address that up front.
But it's interconnected, right? Because to get more high-quality childcare, you need skilled workers. And we as an economy, or in general, have not shown in terms of wages and career development, we have not really put our money where our mouth is in terms of the people providing that early childhood development. So going to get a little bit more specific about what your plans are.
And the pandemic made it even worse when it comes to childcare. Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. I had hoped to already do this, but I apologize, I didn't get it done yet. But very shortly, I will be announcing the creation of a blue ribbon task force that is laser focused on how we make Austin the best city in America to raise a kid. And a key part of that is addressing childcare and early childhood development. Look, we know that childcare is typically the second largest expense in many households behind the housing costs. So if we want to make the city more affordable, and we want to do it with not just more housing, but in other ways that create greater equity, childcare and early childhood development would be a big part of that. If we want Austin to be more equitable as we go toward 2028 and start thinking about the past 100 years, we would look at childcare and early childhood development as a key structural issue that we ought to be addressing between now and 2028. I'm not going to prejudge this task force that I'm going to put in place, but it will be a very blue ribbon task force and have a really short period of time, like 3 months, to come back, because I'm convinced they could probably do it in 3 days. That's the people that are going to be appointed to this. But give everybody 3 months, come back with what the ideas are, and then let's have the public discussion about those specific ideas, how we fund them, what we need to do in terms of funding. And like I say, I would love if at the end of 2 years, at the end of 6 years, to be able to say during that period of time we addressed making Austin the best place in America to raise a kid.
Now that's an incredibly inspiring goal. I find that inspiration, don't we all? Inspiring. How do you do that in a state where Medicaid hasn't been expanded, where we have some of the highest rates of uninsurance, and in particular uninsurance of the young? Are you fighting with one hand behind your back without more support from?
Well, it certainly ain't as easy as it would be, but that's part of the reason to ask the question and to put together the people that I want to put together. Here's the deal. I might, during the course of it, complain that I have one hand tied behind my back, but I know where I live. I know what the problems are going to be. I don't want to focus on those. I want to focus on what I can do.
Yep. Let's talk a little bit about some infrastructure issues and then finally public safety, and then we'll move to your questions. Does that sound okay? Of course, the city approved billions for Project Connect, a pretty ambitious plan. It's become a little bit, the devil's always in the details. As I understand it, the board of Cap Metro and the board of Project Connect, which is going to build, this system, including light rail, that eventually Cap Metro will operate, correct?
Yeah, that's actually called ATP, Austin Transit Partnership.
Oh, the Austin, okay. Now, my understanding is that the ATP and Cap Metro boards aren't always on the same page. How are you kind of addressing that?
Well, a couple of things. One is I anticipate that I'll be on the Austin Transit Partnership board this Thursday and go to my first meeting on Friday. And two things I would say about that. One is the city of Austin, Capital Metro, and the creation of ATP, they're all in it together, right? And it's a triangle, so it ought to be, to use a metaphor, it ought to be the strongest thing on earth, but yet it's not, because it's not aligned.
In love, triangles are complicated.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah, very good point. And we do love our rail opportunities. But here's the thing. We're at a new starting point. And a couple of things have to happen. One is we have to get over the hangover of whatever got us here, right? People that were here that aren't here anymore, people that had visions and ideas that aren't here. We have to start fresh. And I've already had conversations about this and believe that can happen. The second thing is we have to start fresh, in my view, on what it is we're going to do. We all know that costs went up. By the way, that shouldn't have been a surprise to anybody. I mean, we're talking about housing and costs going up. Why would that not happen on rail and the land that you're going to put a rail system on? But here's the way I think we ought to look at it. I think we focus too much on, can we build, have we busted the budget? We ought to focus more on, and this is the way I want to start this conversation new, we ought to focus on what were the problems we were trying to solve when we as citizens voted for a rail system? What were the goals we wanted to achieve when we voted to create a rail system? We know how much money we've got, and now let's go back in and do an analysis of how we use that money to best solve the problems and achieve the goals, instead of wringing our hands and saying, well, we don't have enough money to do what we thought we were going to do. Well, let's analyze where we are.
But to get specific, does that mean, though, that we should do more, say, bus rapid transit, and maybe, like, not rethink the underground stations? I mean, like, by the way, I love subways. I'm from New York.
Sure.
But obviously the nature of mobility is changing. EVs, maybe autonomous coming down the line. As you say, costs of material, supplies, infrastructure, labor have all increased. What does that mean specifically in terms of increasing, reaching these mobility goals?
Well, the answer to your first part of the question is, does it mean more of something or the other? And my answer to that is maybe, because we need to sit down and ask the questions I just asked. I don't think we've been asking those questions for the past 6 months to a year. I think we've been all talking about, well, should we scrap it or not, because it's over budget what we thought it was going to be. This community voted to solve some problems. This community had some goals. We've got a lot of money to try to solve those problems and to try to achieve those goals. Let's go back and figure out what we need to do. And if we don't need an underground mall in downtown, well, we don't need an underground mall in downtown, because that may not have been the problem we were trying to solve or the goal we were attempting to achieve.
So basically, you got to answer the higher order questions before you're able to know which are the more particular questions.
I think that's right, and I don't think we've been asking the higher order questions.
Tell us a little bit about I35 expansion. Anyone who's driven from here to Dallas knows that it is a uniquely challenging experience.
Yes.
And people also know
you lose a little of your soul.
Yeah. Well, and we have more staffers now in Dallas-Fort Worth than ever before. We also know, of course, that I35 itself has a very fraught history, and that
talk about 1928.
Exactly, and that we're all thinking about how our intercity transit, what it's going to look like, not now, but in 20, 30, hopefully 50 years for our descendants. Where do you stand on that project and on the U.S. DOT funding associated with it?
Well, you can always make improvements, and I think it's important to recognize what happened with I-35 started in 2011. The current plan that we're looking at, when the legislature passed a budget rider called Rider 42 to put $300 million into studying the top 50 most congested bits of roadway. In my Senate district, we had 6 of them. So, but one of them was I-35, and I put together a group then, a very smart group of people, and we got some additional money from the city so that we could study I-35 from 45 to 45. And of course, you've got things happening north, you got things happening south, and now we're looking at the central part. And I've been pushing and pushing and pushing to get money to do it and to make improvements on I-35. For example, in 2017, there was still discussion of adding lanes to the upper deck. Well, there was some pushing done, and now we've got it where there is no upper deck. So you bring it down to grade and create the opportunity for there to be even parkland. Now we're going to have to figure out how we finance that. But, you know, this is an opportunity. I mean, think about this. The state of Texas is talking about giving Austin almost $5 billion. That doesn't happen very often. But my point being that that road is a monument to the racist past. And if we can improve it just for that reason, we should do. But what we ought to also be looking at is how do we make the road operate better as a road, which this plan is doing. How do we make it safer, because we're killing people on that road? How do we create better opportunity for transit? And then do it. This town has a perennial problem with transportation because we'll debate it to death, and we've got a real opportunity to do something, and I think we need to do it.
Have you talked with Mitt Romney about the big dig?
I've not.
He might have some useful.
My guess is that there is some useful information there.
One more question. Public safety. Chief Joseph Chacon says that, you know, there's 250 officers short right now. Obviously, everywhere short of police officers and teachers nationwide are leaving their jobs. I'm not saying, and I hope I don't come across as saying, that your challenges are unique, but they are distinct. How do we fill those jobs, and how do we restore a kind of a sense of public safety, particularly downtown?
I think we have to, again, start with focusing on what our goals are. And we don't, it's not mutually exclusive. It's not a binary choice, if you will, to have a policing system that is just and it meets Austin's values. That can be achieved through recruitment, through training, through supervision, and through having a transparent and effective accountability system. But that's not a binary choice, as I said, with having a fully staffed police department. People in this town should be safe, and they should feel safe. And that's regardless of whether you're in your house at 2 o'clock in the morning, you think somebody's breaking in, or you're a person of color in your car is being approached by a police officer. Nobody should fear the police. We can do both of these things, but the city sort of saw some effort to create a binary choice. We need to have, and I talked to the chief very recently, and he's moving with dispatch to have more and more academies. We got to do that. But we also need to have a police contract. We have to be able to send a message to the police we have. You know, first, do no harm. We don't want the folks that we've got not being retained because we're just digging that hole deeper. But we also need to be able to recruit. The best way to do that, I think, is a police contract. There's a lot of complication in that. And, you know, absent a police contract, we need to be doing the kinds of things that demonstrate to those that we want to retain and those that we want to recruit that you can have a career in this town and be proud of it.
I know you can't bargain from this stage, but you are. What I'm hearing is that the police contract is a major focus of your attention right now.
Yes.
And would a successful resolution of that also help with the shortage of 911 operators?
Well, it needs to. That police contract, not so much. But when I talk about being fully staffed, in my head, I'm talking about 911.
Great. I invite members of the audience to please come to the microphone and with your questions. Please identify who you are and keep your question brief.
These questions are pretty short. It's the answers that are hell on us.
Richard Victor, Audits in the Public Interest. Mayor Watson, in asking how you will lead Austin, I think it's fair to ask how you've led in the past. In 2009, you passed Senate Bill 1515, the $290 million incentive for Formula One racing. I did not put the hats out in the room, by the way. We know from land transactions, business formations, open records requests, interviews with those involved, that the idea of constructing that track on the site of a failed subprime subdivision was well underway as early as 2007, but 2008 certainly. First, when you passed Senate Bill 1515 in March to May 2009, were you aware the proceeds from Senate Bill 1515 would be used to finance the special purpose sports facility known as the Circuit of the Americas? And when did you start working on Senate Bill 1515?
First of all, you're incorrect in what you just said about what Senate Bill 1515 did and have been in the past. But what you're incorrect about is what that Senate bill did is it allowed for Formula One racing to qualify under what was already in existence called the Major Events Trust Fund. And that it was not being used as a subsidy for for Circuit of the Americas or anything like that. And what that does is it allows after the fact for an application to be made to be reimbursed for based upon sales tax activity that was brought by whatever the major event is. Things like the Super Bowl, things like NCAA championships, and Formula One racing. It has to go through a process at the state that has nothing to do with me, but it has to do with the comptroller's office that has to be certified. And in some instances, the Circuit of the Americas, I know for a fact, was not awarded money out of the Major Events Trust Fund because they didn't meet certain criteria. So I appreciate the question, and I don't remember when I first started working on it, but that's what that did.
Well, I mean...
Well, sir, one follow-up.
Yeah, follow-up, yes. The Major Events Trust Fund did not exist before your bill. It was a Special Events Trust Fund, and it allowed for only one-year deals. Your change allowed 10 years. That's what you did, and the only event that your bill added was Formula One. It was for Formula One. Your bill
It was to make it where it could
One.
qualify. You're right about that, and that's what I said.
Next question, please. Thank you, sir.
Well, congratulations, Mayor
Thank you,
Watson,
sir.
on your election, and thank you for speaking to us this afternoon. My name is Anthony Collier. I'm General Counsel for Senator Whitmire. My question to you is, do you believe Austin should adopt a strong mayor system? Why or why not?
I favored that and have favored it for a long time, and the reason for that is...
Even now that you're mayor?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, maybe even more now that I'm mayor. I favor it because of accountability. I think it is easier to assure accountability when you're voting for the person that's making the decisions. And I will tell you, this campaign for a year, we ran around this town promising things that were purely management. Because that's what the people are looking for, right? They want their city managed well, and they're voting for a mayor, and they expect that mayor to be the executive that can carry it out. But yet, that mayor has to make sure that the manager is able to do that. So I've always thought from an accountability standpoint, it was a superior system. You could build in the protections that you need to build, but you know, my guess is, and this is not a criticism, but my guess is that most folks in this room wouldn't be able to tell you the name. Maybe this room you could, but the name of the city manager. And that's not a criticism of the city manager. That's the city manager doing a job. But we need to hold somebody accountable, and the best way to do that is elections.
Do you have confidence in City Manager Spencer Cronk?
Well, yeah, I do. And people ask me that question all the time, like they want me to make a decision about what I think about his performance and should we keep him or not keep him. And my position is that you should never take a job like being mayor with the idea that people are going to go, because it's more about the relationship and developing a relationship with him. And we have met multiple times, and I look forward to trying to do that work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question. Thank you.
Hello, and thanks. Okay, going back to something you said earlier about using the housing bond money to augment this income-restricted housing so you could get down to like 30% MFI as opposed to 80%, something like that. If bond money is it's in a sense passed on as a tax in a sort of a way. If you had to keep reissuing it, what would happen when that bond money ran out? Will we have to continually issue bonds? And doesn't that affect kind of everybody?
That's a good question, and that's a financing question. What you need to, when I talk about using it, it may be that you're able to use that so that you can borrow, and then the borrowing pays. And of course, that's part of bonding too, right? But there may be other ways to borrow that you would then be able to pay back with the rents that are being charged, that sort of thing. But that you're right. That financing has to all be worked out. But I want to have the leverage to use that in some way where you can buy that down, and in some instances, well, you get the point. Buy it down so that you're in a position to charge less, so that you have more room for people.
So just a quick follow-up. Are you saying that we have bond money now, we could use it for that purpose now, but we would look for a different finance source in the future to kind of replace that?
Well,
It's
not
a stopgap?
necessarily. We might look. You can use it all, right? Use every tool you got. But if you've got the ability to use that as leverage in some instances to borrow where it's cheaper than issuing the bonds, do that. So what I'm talking about is just being very sophisticated about how we get our hands on various sources of money. I just happened to mention bond money because we all understand that we voted for a bunch of bonds.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Next question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Roxy Zoll. I work at Ms. Magazine. Studies show that young people are deciding where to live and work based on a state's abortion bans. Obviously, Texas currently outlaws abortion altogether, despite the fact that 78% of Texas voters think it should be allowed. I know your hands are tied. I know this was not your decision to pass SB 8, but is there anything that the city can do to increase abortion access? I know City Council decriminalized abortion, but are there further actions that your office can take, maybe putting pressure on top employers or messaging campaigns toward Austin residents?
Well, I will explore anything. You may not know me, but people that do know me in this room know that I have been a very strong defender of a woman's right to have an abortion and reproductive rights. And I will continue to do that. But you are right that the state has done a lot of hand tying and even made, in some instances, doing something to be helpful, whether you can be punished. So we need to follow the law, but any ideas you have,
I'll be in touch.
that's right. No, and so long as we can do what I'm for, trying to figure out how we do things the right way and we protect a woman's right to her reproductive rights and her right to have an abortion, and that's where I've been for a long, long time.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about those 50,000 open jobs we're talking about. You know, perhaps they might be open because people are afraid to move here.
Yeah.
Well,
There's a human capital question
yeah,
ultimately.
you ask a good question.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Roxy. Next question.
Thank you, Mayor. Alex Mead, I have a very short question. How do we ensure that the airport grows enough to meet the needs of a growing city?
Well, first of all, we don't fall 6 years behind, which is about what I would say we're behind right now. I think we're about 6 years behind on getting that done. And then what I also think we need to do is pretty immediately create the airport has to go through the permitting process and do all this and stand in line with everybody else. We need to create an airport-focused entity that is working to get our airport built. It's one thing to trip somebody else, but it's another thing to trip over our own feet trying to get the airport built. And then don't fall behind. Go back to what I was saying. We were becoming a big city. We are now a big city. We got to stay ahead of the game.
Two more only, please. I'm so sorry.
Robert Van Boven. I'm a neurologist in Lakeway. Good to see you.
See you.
First of all, I just want to compliment. I'm amazed with the breadth and depth of your knowledge, but
Thank you.
moreover, the wisdom through the long view that you have. And I think it's very promising
Thank
for
you.
the city. Getting back to your point about this chasm between jobs and local qualified folks, what do you see in terms of the city's role to increase access to the type of technical skills to improve the local workforce for kids out of high school, out of college, et cetera?
Great question. And so what I envision, and when I said I was going to lay out something in the next few months, what I envision is creating a network, if you will, consortium, if you will, of building trades, skilled trades, and ACC, which already does a tremendous job when it comes to workforce development, HT, St. Ed's, Concordia, and of course UT too, but put all that together in a network where what we're doing is identifying the jobs, identifying the gaps, and then starting as early as like 9th grade, working through Workforce Solutions Central Texas, working to get a focus there so that literally when a kid comes out of high school, they either have an apprenticeship or they have a certificate, and they can continue going to college if that's what they want to do. But we've identified the jobs, and we've got them into those jobs. And one other thing I'll say about that, go back to structural. What we know is if we focus on kids in certain schools, we know that many of them have parents that are underemployed and with a little bit of training could be in better jobs. So at the same time, we might get a double bang for our buck if we do this the right way.
Fascinating. Final question.
First of all, congratulations,
Thank
Mayor
you.
Watson.
Good to see you.
Thank you, sir. My question is the workforce, and it's a two-phase, which almost links with his. The workforce is suffering. You see signs all over the place saying waitresses wanted and dishwashers wanted, et cetera, et cetera. So, rideshare companies offer the flexibility of saying work as you want, days you want. And this is hurting our workforce. And the infrastructure also, if we have more training within big companies like Tesla, where we have high school students working within those companies, would you explore that?
Say that last part.
Would you explore
Sure.
for big companies like Tesla, Samsung, Motorola, in the high school level,
Yes.
junior high, getting them prepped to learn to work with skills and to give up maybe rideshare companies and going into.
Yeah, I got you. So, yeah, that's a good question. And I have a two-part answer. One is a lot of our major employers do more than a lot of folks know in terms of that kind of training and have partnerships with different institutions to do that kind of training. That's not to say we shouldn't put that on steroids, right? And that's the second part of the answer, which is when I described an outline of what I would like to do from a workforce development standpoint, I should say, you're right, I should say that as part of my answer because we need to have the employers be a part of that network I just talked about because they're going to, A, help us identify the jobs, B, help us identify the gaps, and C, hire the folks when we get them trained.
Thank you. Will you allow me speaker's prerogative?
Sure.
Two final questions. One, there's a certain legislature in session right now. You were a member of that legislature for a while, as I understand. One of the reasons I believe that you ultimately were elected mayor is that you have the relationships. What are you doing? What do you want from Austin, from the ledge right now, and what do you wish the ledge does not do for this session specifically?
Well, filing deadline hadn't come and gone yet, so there may be additions to this answer. You've seen the obvious bills like creating the District of Austin, where the city of Austin wouldn't have the ability to govern itself. You've seen bills like the District of Austin, where you would take away policing and give it to DPS, and you've seen you'll see some disannexation bills. You'll probably see a bill. In fact, I've been told you'll see a bill maybe as early as today that addresses how Austin and other cities, but it's clearly directed at Austin, deals with parkland dedication fees and what it charges in terms of parkland dedication fees. I've already been at the Capitol. I've already been on the phone. I've been talking to a lot of people because I really do believe that being in the legislature and being the mayor of the capital city of Texas requires relationships. And they need to be positive relationships, even if I don't agree with somebody on every issue. So I've already started the process of talking to people about what that bill would really do and how this might affect something and have unintended consequences. And I'll just do like I did in the legislature. I had, if I do say so myself, really great success in the legislature because of those relationships. And, you know, one of the things that I think is really important is that you put down the phone and not tweet at folks. You know, you will never see me tweet at an elected official because that's not a good dialogue.
That'd be the most productive way.
And you're just not going to do that.
And now we've got our U.S. senators doing that, of course.
Well,
and
but yeah, but
former U.S. president.
So I'll continue to look. I love the fact that Austin is the capital city. I don't know why we don't embrace that more. We are very, very unique in the sense that we're the capital of the state of Texas, but yet we act like that's not something we want to be. I think we ought to embrace that more.
Finally, will you? Do you intend to run again in 2024?
Yes.
In order to then have at least a 6-year run at the challenges you're confronting?
Well, yes, I intend to run again, and I've said that before. And if I were to change that answer after only 17 days,
well, I had to throw a softball.
Here's what I'll say. Yeah, but here's what I'll say, and my constituents and people that care about this city deserve to know it. It was not an easy decision to run for mayor. But I'm about as happy right now as I've been since pre-pandemic. And now granted, it's only been 17 days, but the truth of the matter is it's because of what we've just been talking about. I am enormously excited about the future of this city. And I can't believe I get to play such a big role. So thank you all.
And with that, we're out of time. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mayor Watson, for joining us here and virtually. Thank you to our panelists, to our sponsors, and good luck to you, Mayor.
Thank you. Thank you all.